But I thought now is a propitious time to talk a little bit about a man who is the opposite of that, and that's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin. What do we know about this guy? A couple of things. After graduating from Leningrad State University in 1975, he went to law school, you see, because that was the quickest way to be picked up by the KGB. He immediately joined the Soviet intelligence service. He was posted to Dresden in 1985. We looked for East Germans who had plausible reasons to travel abroad and then recruited them to help spy on the West. So he worked with the infamous Stasi in East Germany. And during his time in the KGB, he worked as a case officer and reached the rank of lieutenant colonel, meaning he was brutal as hell. Mr. Putin was recalled to Leningrad in 1990 as part of the KGB's active reserve as the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Now, in 1996, he moved to Moscow and started work in the Kremlin, where he was eventually appointed head of Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor of the KGB, in 1998. He had a meteoric rise, as you can see. Barely a year later, he was named one of Russia's first deputy prime ministers and then acting prime minister by Boris Yeltsin, the president at the time. He was very ill. He had a drinking issue. There was corruption going on all around him. He himself was not corrupt. And as the word goes, he was blackmailed. That's the word, that he was blackmailed by, among others, Putin. Get out. We won't charge you for these violations of law, but I want to be the next prime minister or president of Russia. So when President Yeltsin resigned, he was made acting president and officially elected president in March 2000. Now, there's a lot more to say about the man, but I can't spend all day on this. But I want you to have a taste of it. Putin has been, as the BBC reports, in power since 2000, longer than any Kremlin leader since Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. More than Brezhnev ever was, Khrushchev for sure. He's been in office longer than Joseph Stalin. He's now into his fifth term as president. He's 72 years old. All semblance of opposition to his rule is gone. And there is little to stop him from staying on if he wants until 2036 or beyond. Although he appeared to embrace liberal democratic Russia early on, when the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred, he later described the chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union as the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And boy, does he want to stay in power. I have a long list, too long to go over. I mean, I would wind up going into Lara Trump show. List of the people who've been assassinated, who've been killed. In fact, the printer was going on so long, I was afraid we run out of ink, so I told Mr. Producer, that's enough already. You know, people who just happen to think they're Superman and jump out of the 19th floor of all these high rises, or they happen to stab themselves in the back, shoot themselves in the back of the head, and their family members too, you know, stuff like that. Or they have poison that only the Kremlin knows how to develop, and we're talking about murdering people in Russia, outside of Russia, it doesn't matter. He has no real opposition left. We're talking about journalists, we're talking about opposition party leaders, we're talking about oligarchs who don't give him, you know, what he wants. Gone. Now, according to reports, speaking of this, the dictator owns a fleet of luxury cars, dozens of private jets, palatial mega yachts, including one worth $900 million, an extensive designer wardrobe, and a high-end watch collection worth millions. Many think he's the richest man in the world. Among those, Elon Musk thinks he's the richest man in the world. Experts claim his real estate holdings are in the billions, including a castle-like mansion on the outskirts of Moscow that's twice the size of Buckingham Palace. But his pride enjoys a sprawling billion-dollar estate overlooking the Black Sea. You can see this on the internet. And boasting dozens of bedrooms, a private nightclub, a casino, an underground ice hockey rink, a movie theater, and a wine vineyard. The enormous property sits on scores of acres of manicured gardens, has been dubbed Putin's Palace by critics. It's reportedly worth $2.8 billion, but I understand Letitia James says it's worth about $18 million. The president, that is Putin, denies that he owns it. He claims he only makes a salary of $140,000 a year. And so he is massively wealthy, massively powerful. He does not suffer any opponents of any kind. I haven't even gotten to the number of military personnel that he has, quote unquote, disappeared. And he's a warmonger. You isolationists out there who back Putin, he's the warmonger. Now, we know what Putin wants to do. Why? Because he wrote about it, or somebody else did in 2021, right here. And he wrote about it. And in 2024, when he was up for another one of those fabulous Democratic presidential elections, he gave a big speech kind of talking about the same thing, but it goes on and on. Probably had a ghostwriter like most authors do, except me. And he had this published. And in here, he basically claims all of Europe once spoke Russian, or the ancient words that are now Russian. And he goes into this. So Ukraine is a problem because Ukraine stands between Russia and all these NATO countries. So he's got to take out Ukraine. And besides, there are people in Ukraine who speak Russian. Well, there's people in Newark, New Jersey who speak Russian. That shouldn't mean anything. But apparently it does to him. And so all of Europe used to speak Russian, as I said, or the ancient language of Russian. And his eyes are really set beyond Ukraine, on Poland. What is it about Poland? Hitler wanted Poland. Stalin wanted Poland. The Tsar wanted Poland. Putin wants Poland. And so that's what's going on. In this long diatribe, this 2021, he talks about Poland, Romania, Lithuania, talks about most of Europe, even goes beyond Europe. It's a really amazing thing. So he is a megalomaniac, and he really is an imperialist and a warmonger. Now, let's take a look at this whole issue with Ukraine. Let's begin here. In 1994, there was something called the Budapest Memorandum. I've talked about this a long time ago, the Budapest Memorandum. What in the world is the Budapest Memorandum? Well, as the Brookings Institute points out, and they're a liberal organization, and I'm quoting a liberal organization because they actually got it right. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, nuclear arms lay in sites scattered across the former Soviet republics. Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, including some 1,900 strategic nuclear weapons designed to strike the United States. Nothing in the post-Soviet space commanded more attention from Bush 41 and Clinton administrations than making sure that the Soviet Union's demise did not increase the number of nuclear-armed states. Washington brokered with Kiev and Moscow the terms under which Ukraine agreed to eliminate the strategic missiles, missile silos, and bombers on its territory and transfer it all to Russia. How do you like that? If they had had the nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them, I don't think Russia would have attacked Ukraine, or I think President Trump is 100% correct. If he had been president, Russia would not have attacked Ukraine. A key element of the arrangement, many Ukrainians would say the key element, was the readiness of the United States and Russia, joined by Britain, to provide security assurances. We provided security assurances. So did Russia. So did Britain. The Budapest Memorandum committed Washington, Moscow, and London, among other things, to, quote, respect the independence and sovereignty of existing borders of Ukraine, unquote, and to, quote, refrain from the threat of use of force, unquote, against that country, Ukraine. The Kremlin has violated these commitments. I think that's fairly obvious. Using soldiers in Russian combat fatigues without identifying insignia, who Mr. Putin later admitted were Russian. Moscow seized Crimea. Russia subsequently encouraged and armed separatists in eastern Ukraine. When the Ukrainian military appeared to gain the upper hand against the separatists, regular Russia army units entered Donetsk and Luhansk to support them. There was the Orange Revolution. Now, what was that? Ukraine was long part of the Soviet Union, but became independent in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian candidate, won the election for president of Ukraine, but the election was known to be fraudulent with Russian interference. This led to what was called the Orange Revolution, massive protests against this Russian puppet president. And that in turn led to another election. This time, pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko won. Putin was furious. He declared this second election a farce. By the way, so the isolationists in our country. That's a farce. Why? Putin says so. Anyway, that's just the beginning of it. In 1991, Georgia became independent from the collapsing Soviet Union and allied with the West. In 2008, South Ossetia, part of Georgia, was trying to break away from Georgia. Russia sent troops into support of the rebels. A war broke out between Russia and Georgia, which, of course, Russia won. The result, South Ossetia was recognized as its own country. There was no pushback from the international community. Putin took note of that. Then we have Crimea. Putin was emboldened. Now remember, this Ukrainian president who was said to be pro-West, well, suddenly he kind of switched sides. People think he was bought off. He was poised to sign an agreement with the European Union, formalizing an alliance with Europe, not NATO, with the EU. But he got cold feet and he backed out all of a sudden. Well, the public was furious. Remember? There was a second election. They just elected this guy because he was anti-Russia and pro-West. Well, the public was angry. The guy had reversed course. So he was ousted as president and he fled to Russia. So in 2014, Putin invaded Crimea, which is Ukrainian territory, and then he annexed it. It is strategically important. It essentially sits in the Black Sea. Again, there was no effective pushback by the international community. So he's taking parts of Ukraine. He's involved in their election. He's taking now Crimea. He takes part of Georgia. And he said, hey, nobody's pushing back, man. I can keep moving. And then we have a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Putin launched a massive full-scale military invasion, as you know, into Ukraine, declaring it a special military operation. He claimed Ukraine was controlled by neo-Nazis who were threatening Russia. He claimed that he was coming to the defense of the Russian population in eastern Ukraine. This time, of course, there was worldwide condemnation. Now, our president, the great president, Donald Trump, he talks frequently about the casualties there. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has done better than most in trying to figure out the number. This is unbelievable. But since January 2024, Russia has lost roughly 1,149 armored fighting vehicles, almost 3,100 infantry fighting vehicles, 300 self-propelled artillery. Even more noteworthy, Russian equipment losses have been significantly higher than Ukrainian losses, varying between a ratio of 5-to-1 and 2-to-1 in Ukraine's favor. Russian fatalities and casualties have been extraordinary. Russia will likely hit the 1 million casualty mark in the summer of 2025, and they have. Over 1 million casualties. A stunning and grisly milestone overall. A high of 250,000 Russian soldiers have died in Ukraine, with over 950,000 total Russian casualties. A sign of Putin's blatant disregard for his soldiers. To put these numbers into historical perspective, Russia has suffered roughly 5 times as many fatalities in Ukraine as in all Russian and Soviet wars combined between the end of World War II and the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. And again, I'm not even counting another 7 months. In addition, Russian fatalities in Ukraine in just over 3 years are 15 times larger than the Soviet Union's decade-long war in Afghanistan, 10 times larger than Russia's 13 years war in Chechnya. Ukrainian fatality rates are also high, at between 60,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, far more Russians, with a total of 400,000 casualties, which include both killed and wounded. So you're talking about in the neighborhood of 1.5 million deaths and casualties between the Russians and the Ukrainians. That is astonishing. Astonishing. One of the reasons this needs to stop is not only because of the carnage that's taking place here, but because Putin has said Ukraine is just the beginning. Now, it's not American neocons saying that, or warmongers, or Jews. No, it's Putin. He says it. He wrote it. He says it a lot. You know, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we ought to listen to these people like Hamas. We ought to listen to them like Iran. We ought to listen to them like North Korea, like Communist China, like Putin and Russia. Not because we like what they say, not because it's music to our ears, but they don't hide it. We want to destroy the West. We want to destroy the United States. We want to invade Taiwan. We want to destroy the Jews in Israel. They mean what they say. They mean what they say. And we ought to pay attention to it. Anyway, Putin is doing what he's doing. Donald Trump is dealing with it as effectively, more effectively, certainly, than any president of the United States could or any leader of the world could. That gives me a lot of solace, as a matter of fact. And don't forget this whole idea that I talk about, this power. You see Putin, you see Xi, you see Un in North Korea, you see Iran, you see Hamas, you see all of this. It is important to understand what we're talking about here in terms of power. And it's also important to understand what we're talking about in our own country with the rise of the Marxist Islamists, with the rise of the metastasizing anti-Semitism. It all comes down to power. Positive, good power, bad, negative power. And we really need to comprehend this as a free people in order to protect ourselves from negative power and push back and promote positive power. We'll be right back.